Hey, everybody, welcome to part one of our series in the book of Ruth. Now, this sermon was delivered, it looks like January 8th of 2024 at Beacon Church in Elk Point, South Dakota. Unfortunately, we didn't press record on that day, so I have my notes right in front of me, and I'm going to try to do my best to give you a shortened version of what we talked about on that day. First, I'm going to take time to read the first chapter of the book of Ruth, Ruth 1, verses 1 through 22. And then once I've read the first chapter, we will go through the entire thing. I hope this benefits you. I hope you took time to check out the series intro beforehand, because I might just mention a few things so that they're kind of flags in your mind, but hopefully you'll go back and go, what is that Hesed word again? Oh, right, it's okay. All of that groundwork is laid in the previous video. So make sure you can hit pause, open a new tab, watch that intro, and then come back to this one, and we'll see you back here shortly to begin Ruth chapter 1. All right, I froze to give you time to pause it and go. All right, let's take a look at Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, "During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. She and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, 'Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness, Hesed, to you, as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband.' She kissed them, and they wept loudly. They said to her, 'We insist on returning with you to your people.' But Naomi replied, 'Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters. My life is much too bitter for you to share.'" Listen to that again. "My life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't plead with me to abandon you, or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. The 2 of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That was Ruth chapter 1, and the message for today was entitled Hesed or Mara. Hesed or Mara. Again, if you're unsure what Hesed is, go back to the series intro. But we'll talk more about it in just a second. So one of the joys of being a parent of 4 young kids is rediscovering all the old Disney movies that I grew up with. We have that Disney Plus subscription, which is so cool because I don't have to wade through all those VHS tapes anymore or keep them all on DVD or buy the new releases. I pay the monthly fee, which I probably shouldn't, and we have all those old wonderful films at our fingertips. And as a child, I saw them through my own childlike lens, but as a dad now, I get to watch my kids go on that emotional roller coaster for the very first time. I get to see them, wiggle to the amazing songs. I get to see them enjoy the childlike jokes. I get to see them completely miss the jokes that were aimed at grown-ups that I get now that I didn't get then. And often I get to watch them go like, this is awesome. And it'll be kind of on repeat for the next couple of weeks. But there's one problem that I didn't realize how devastating the beginning of most of those Disney movies are. I mean, they're kids' movies, but it's intense. Like the first 15 minutes of most of them, it's terrible. I mean, Mufasa is over here getting trampled to death. Aladdin is homeless and scraping for a life on the streets through crime, right? An arrogant prince is mean to someone at the door and gets turned into a horrific beast and kidnaps a beautiful girl's father. The emperor gets turned into a llama. I mean, that's frightening. I guess the coup de grace is Bambi's mom. Do you remember Bambi's mom? Just the score, I could just listen to the sound of that music and instantly be like, yep, I am fully in tears right now at Bambi's mom. It's horrific. It's terrible. And we give these to our kids. I mean, why do all of these stories, these great stories that we love, why do they all start in such a terrible, dark place? Well, the truth is, all storytellers know that loss is a profound motivator. It causes people to shift. It causes people to change. It causes people to either completely collapse and fall apart or to rise to the occasion and to go do something. Tragedy and loss are a catalyst for something in our lives. They can be a catalyst for growth, or they can be a catalyst for death and destruction. And it's up to us to figure out which of these two paths are we going to take after tragedy. Most of us are familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, where we relive those horrible events over and over and over again unconsciously. There's another side of trauma that we don't often talk about as much, which is post-traumatic growth. It's an observable phenomenon. They started really researching it in the 1990s. But the opposite can be true, where instead of being paralyzed by the traumatic events of our pasts, if we will process them and decide to move forward, we can actually see tremendous growth on the other side that we may arguably have never achieved had we not gone through that loss. So we open the story of Ruth on what I like to call the black canvas. It is ugly. It is death. The first 5-6 verses, you have this family who starts out living in Bethlehem, a mom, a dad, and 2 sons. They're living in Bethlehem, and there is a famine in Bethlehem. Now, this is interesting. The word Bethlehem means house of bread. This is the house of bread. This is supposed to be the fertile area where all the grain comes from, right? It's the breadbasket of Israel. And what's happening? A profound lack of bread. There's a famine in the house of bread. It represents the fact that Israel is completely fruitless and empty and barren in this time. This black canvas is actually kind of fully extrapolated in just the first phrase of the first sentence. It says, during the time of the judges. Now, if you read the book before this, the book of Judges, and the book after this, you know that we're in a really unique window in Israel's history. They have been exiled from Egypt. They've wandered for 40 years in the desert, and they have gone into the promised land. Now, they took over the promised land in the book of Judges, but they didn't do it correctly. They didn't fully, exile all of the evil that was there, all of the worship of foreign gods, and all of the other people groups that were there. And they were supposed to completely evacuate those other people groups and take dominion over the entirety of the promised land. But instead of doing that, they fell short, and it starts this long cycle of Israel failing really epically. And then God raising up a deliverer, a Gideon or a Samson or a Barak or a Deborah, to deliver them and to bring peace for a time. And then in that peace, they wander far from God again. And it's just the end of the book of Judges, right before the book of Ruth starts, is horrendous. It's truly awful where the people of God are in this time. And there's the big running theme through the book of Judges is there was no king, so everyone did exactly as they wanted to, right? Everyone did what they saw was right in their own eyes. And that is the time period in which Ruth is cast into. It is an ugly time. And as a result, I think, of their sin and brokenness, Israel is experiencing a profound famine. And there is famine in the very heart of Israel, in Bethlehem, in the bread basket. There's a famine in the house of bread. But very shortly, Israel is not the only person or the only entity that is fruitless and empty. What happens to Naomi, in essence, she says it herself, I went away full, but I came back empty. Her husband passes away, which is difficult and tragic, but not unexpected sometimes. But you would think that her two sons would then be able to take up the husband's mantle and take care of her. But her two sons also die after taking Moabite wives. So Naomi, just like Israel, is completely empty, barren, and fruitless, with the inability to provide an heir for the next generation. All she has left are two daughters-in-law, which in this time culture, it's not nice to say in 2024, but women were not allowed to own property. They were property themselves. They could represent the sale of a property, as you'll see later, but Elimelech and his two sons were their entire hope for a financial future. And so now they're essentially going to become beggars and try to scrape together a living somehow, but they have no earning power and they have no chance to be taken care of in Moab. Their futures are completely listless. So that emptiness, that barrenness, that fruitlessness is a really profound hurt to Naomi, I believe. So they were in Bethlehem and they went to Moab for 10 years, which is really an enemy, a sworn enemy of Israel. And they're here in Moab. And now, after all this death and all this loss and all this famine and all this train wreck that's happened in Naomi's life, she's walking back with her two daughters-in-law. And there really are two divergent paths set before us in this. As we see these two characters walking back, we see one character in Naomi who is overwhelmed with her own bitterness and hurt and frustration, and one character who displays profound Hesed, love, and kindness. And I believe that the choice for us today is between how Naomi reacts to these traumatic circumstances versus how Ruth reacts to these traumatic circumstances. Hence, we have the path of Hesed or the path of Mara at this figurative crossroads to the traumatic loss that they've experienced. First, we see Naomi's reaction to all the terrible things that have happened. There are three things that I found particularly telling. That is her bitterness, her isolation, and her blame. Naomi's bitterness, isolation, and blame. Naomi says, call me Mara. That means bitter. But in verse 13, she says, my life is too bitter to share. She is not able to forgive or forget. She is not able to move on. She is stuck in the bitterness of the hurt. She has not healed from any of it. She is bitter to the core. And so in verse 20, when she arrives back home, she tries to change her own name, which, if you know about Abraham and you know about Israel being called Abram and Jacob, respectively, you know that a change of name represents something in the Bible. This is like the only failed name change, I think, that happens in Scripture. But she says, call me Mara. Mara just means bitter in that language, because God has done all these things to me. So have you ever met someone or yourself been so hurt by someone or something in your past that you become a shriveled shell of bitterness, of frustration, of anger, of lashing out, unable to move on or to let go? She is completely overwhelmed in her own bitterness at this loss. Secondly, we see because of the bitterness, she moves to isolate herself. When her daughters-in-law are going with her, in verse 11, she says, why would you want to go with me? Look at the state of my life. Look at what God has done to me. Why are you even here? And she's pushing away the only people who are trying to stay close to her. And then in verse 13, she says, my life is too bitter to share. She's like, I can be bitter all by myself, but I can't stay bitter and try to share my life with someone else. There's a good truth there that I could preach on, but I won't worry about it now. But this move toward isolation is the natural outflow of her own bitterness and hurt about these things that have happened to her. So we see her bitterness, her isolation, and most important of all, we see her blame. She places blame in this chapter squarely on God, which really is not unfair. When it comes to life and death, God is the author of these things. When it comes to things like famine, God is often the one to blame in these instances. But she looks out, and because she blames God, she cannot move forward. But let's just look at a couple of different instances. In verses 13 and 21, she says that God is against her. She believes God is against her. One says that God is turned against her. One says that God is opposed to her. They both mean the same idea. Her core belief on the other side of this traumatic instance is that God is against her. God does not love her. God is not good to her. God is against her. Secondly, she blames God for her bitterness. In verse 20, she says, God is the one who has made me bitter. In verse 21, she blames God. She says, God is the one who took everything from me. And in verse 21, she says that God has afflicted her, meaning God likes to see me suffer. These are the negative beliefs that she has latched onto on the other side of these traumatic losses. And they're not impossible to understand. She has experienced this such profound, deep pain and anger. And so the beliefs that she holds are that God is against her. God is the one that wants to see her bitter. God has taken everything away from her, and God enjoys seeing her suffer. Now, I wish that I could go on today and counteract all of these, but that doesn't happen really till the end of the book of Ruth. So you need to watch to the very end of the film to see if this is true. Is God against Naomi? You've got to go to chapter 4 to find out. Is God making her bitter in this moment? Maybe. But check out what he does for her in chapter 4. Has God taken everything away from Naomi? Maybe so, but look at chapter 4. Does God enjoy seeing her suffer? Is God afflicting her for a sick sense of twisted amusement? Go look at chapter 4 and you'll find out. That's my way of softening the blow, because I can't, I want to say that she shouldn't believe those things. Well, in the moment she's in, it's reasonable. However, it's not the whole story. Go to chapter 4 to figure out the rest. So that's Naomi's reaction: bitterness, isolation, and blame. What about Ruth's reaction? Ruth's reaction to tragedy and trauma was not bitterness, isolation, and blame. Her reaction was to say, where you go, I will go. Naomi gave her like multiple chances, was arguing till she was blue in the face, telling Ruth to go away and leave her alone. And Ruth said, I refuse to do that. This is such an obvious overflow of Hesed love. That commitment that she made, that Ruth made to her husband, that covenant to her husband, meant that Ruth and Naomi were now family. And Ruth is, let's say, heaven bent. I wanted to say hell bent, but I'll say heaven bent on seeing that covenant relationship through. She is bent on being faithful to love and serve her mother-in-law. So we see a couple of things about Hesed love based on the way that Ruth decides to operate to Naomi in these tragic circumstances. Number one, Hesed love happens in relationship. It happens in relationship, in close relationship, I should say. What does Ruth do on the other side of her tragedy and trauma? She walks with Naomi. She cries with Naomi. She clings to Naomi. She chooses to connect with someone else, to be close with someone else, rather than to be in bitterness and isolation apart from someone else. She chooses community over isolation. And this is not easy. In fact, I think it's miraculous. I think the human condition, the human heart wants to go towards Naomi's solution. And it takes a divine act of God to allow us to foster this Hesed love that Ruth displays. So the question there is, in your most difficult moments, are you running to people that you love and trust? Or are you running away from people that you love and trust? Naomi ran away, but Ruth clung to, even when her heart was breaking, she clung to someone else. Hesed love like that always happens in relationship. Number two, I believe Hesed love flows out of submission to God. Ruth, I don't think, could have made this assertion that she was going to stay with her until she made this one key statement: your God will be my God, and may the Lord, she used his proper name there, may Yahweh punish me severely if I abandon you. She's not just submitted to some lofty idea. She's not just clinging to the memory of her husband, saying, well, I'm just going to, serve my mother-in-law because she's the last remaining. No, she's saying, I am submitting myself to your God, to the God of Israel, to the God of Scripture, to the one true living God. I'm submitting myself to him as a part of her commitment, her Hesed commitment, her loving, faithful covenant commitment to Naomi. I don't think you can exhibit true love without a true submission to the God who is love. So Ruth clings to Naomi, and she submits to God on the other side of her traumatic instance. And then number three, we see that Hesed love requires determination. It requires longevity. It requires endurance. Yes, I may say, where you go, I go. Where you serve, where you stay, I'll stay. Where you die, I'll die. That's a nice thing to say, but it's not Hesed love until you've put it into practice over days and weeks and months and years and a lifetime, ultimately. That's real covenant Hesed love, because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is determined. He is enduring in his promises. Even when the people of Israel were an absolute dumpster fire, he was faithful to his side of the promise. And it's a beautiful thing. Eventually, I kind of find it a funny little sentence in here, but it says that eventually Naomi saw that Ruth was never going to leave up, never going to give up. So Naomi just stops talking. She just stops arguing. I mean, for all I know, they just made the walk from Moab back to Bethlehem in complete silence. Naomi just giving her the cold shoulder. And she's like, well, I guess I can't shake this girl, so I might as well just go on. That kind of determination that Ruth showed is not common and is not fleshly. It is something supernatural and loving that only can happen through faithful, committed Hesed love. So here's the choice before us today. How far? I have no idea how long I've been talking. I wish I knew. But the truth for today is that sometimes in life we experience profound, traumatic loss in our lives. Just like the start where Naomi feels like she has lost everything. In those moments, we can either act like Naomi and retreat into our bitterness, isolation, and blame, or we can press in to loving, healthy, committed relationships with others. It requires a real vulnerability. It requires real sacrifice. It requires real commitment. And I believe it requires submitting yourself to God, humbling yourself before Him, and saying, I'm not going to blame you, I'm going to serve you. That's difficult. But the very last verse of this whole thing, after they've chosen their paths, Naomi has chosen her bitterness, Ruth has chosen her Hesed love, they arrive to Bethlehem right at the beginning of the barley harvest. And this seems like somewhat an inconsequential detail, but it struck me as I was preparing for this message and as I preached it back in January that, God's timing is crazy. They could have showed up at pretty much any time, but they didn't show up in time for a feast. There wasn't bread sitting on the table ready to go. They didn't show up in time for a fast. There was no rest. They showed up at harvest time, which I think most farmers will tell you is the most encouraging and the most mind-numbingly difficult season of the entire year. You have this window. It's, crops are ripe enough. Crops have reached a certain moisture point. Like we have a window for the weather. And while it's still dry and we have got to go right now. They arrived to Israel not in time for everything to be made easy. They arrived in time to get to work. It was time for them to roll up their sleeves if they wanted to survive. It would require a sunrise to sunset kind of an effort. Those were the hours of operation for these harvest operations. Sunrise to sunset. We're going to wake up with the sun. We're going to work as long as we possibly can with a little lunch break. And then when the sun goes down, we go grab some sleep and do it all over again. That is the harvest season. And Naomi and Ruth are coming from a famine into a harvest, which is beautiful in one sense, that they're arriving in time, that the house of bread is living up to its name again. But it's difficult in that it's going to require work. It's in the next chapter, we're going to see Ruth has to get sweat on her brow, and she's probably hungry, and she's probably thirsty, and she's probably tired, and she's certainly grieving, and she is going through this enormous, untenable change in her life, moving to a different country, going to people who probably speak a slightly different language, going to be an outsider in a foreign land, and she's got to go get to work. But the beauty of it is, yes, it requires work. But on the other side of that work, there's a harvest. On the other side of the famine, there's a harvest. There's healing on the other side of the grieving. There's flourishing on the other side of the scarcity. But you got to get back to Bethlehem, and you got to get into the fields. You've got work to do. Back to the place of His promise. Back to the divine breadbasket for your life. I mean, are you looking for satisfaction and fulfillment outside of the promised land? Or are you willing to walk that long, difficult path right back into the middle of what He's prepared for you? Are you just ruminating on a lifetime of hurts and pushing other people away? Are you keeping loved ones at arm's length so that you won't be hurt again? Are you hardening your heart so that others won't help you? Well, I think Ruth would encourage you to do the opposite. She would tell you, no matter what pain you're going through, I've been through it. You've been hungry at night, she's been there. You're grieving the loss of a loved one, she's been there. And you know what she chose to do? She chose to cling to her loved ones. She chose to sit with them in the middle of her tragedy and walk with them into a new, unknown season. on the other side. She chose to show them the kind of love that she desperately wanted to be shown. And she chose to take a long walk into God's land of promise, where God has amazing plans set up for her, where she is going to be given an abundant harvest over and over and over again for a lifetime. That's what's on the other side of her harvest work. They started this chapter in scarcity, in famine, in death, in lack, in fruitlessness, in childlessness. And the story from here on out is God's story of taking them from this moment of traumatic, awful, using Ruth's Hesed love and faithfulness to bring such abundance that they could have never imagined. Not just for themselves, not just for a full stomach, but for generation after generation after generation of God's love being poured out for all humanity through Jesus. So that was, in essence, the sermon I preached in January, but the call is the same today, and really every day. So you've been hurt. You're going through untold difficulty, a trial that you never signed up for, a trauma that you never saw coming. You have two choices. Will you choose Mara, to stay stuck in bitterness, to stay alone, to blame God for all the terrible things you've seen happen? Or will you choose the path of Hesed, the path of love, the path that leads back into God's presence, that leads back into his abundance, that breaks down the bitterness, that bridges the gap of isolation? And I promise you, if you will operate in that Hesed love, suddenly the blame you feel for God will be replaced by a gratitude for what he is about to do in the next season. I love y'all. Have a good one. I wish I could lay my hands on you and pray over you. I mean, I guess this is YouTube, so you could comment something or email us or text me. I don't know how to do an altar call on YouTube, but I just want you to know that whatever you're going through, there are people that want to pray with you. If you don't have a church community to get connected to, join us at Beacon Church. Right now, we're meeting at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings at the Elk Point Jefferson School District Middle School gym. That may change by the time you're watching this, so just go to beaconchurch.info, and hopefully we can get you directed to the right resources there. But yeah, I love y'all. Choose Chesed today. See ya.